Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about the panel we have in celebration of Go Beyond the Grain. So what is Go Beyond the Grain? And just a little bit of background. The Google Food team does a campaign every year on whole grains. And this year, in celebration of the Year of the Pulse, we've included pulses. So we're going beyond just grains. And we want to talk about how good grains and pulses are not only for your body and health, but also for the environment, and also how they can be really delicious. So this panel is a perfect representation of tying that all together. And with us today, we have Minh Tsai from Hodo Soy Beanery. This is Minh, and we'll talk about the culinary side and how delicious soy and pulses can be. And then we have Liz Carlisle, author of Lentil Underground. She'll talk a lot about the history of and including into food systems in general and sustainable agriculture, and how pulses and lentils really are a big supporter of sustainable agriculture and support of a healthy ecosystem. And then Larry Kushi is a nutritional epidemiologist with Kaiser Permanente and is here. We'll talk a little bit about the health benefits. So without further delay, I'm going to pass it on to our panel leader, Liz. And thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks so much to our speakers for being here.
Thank you so much, Krista. And thanks for all of you taking your time here, present with us in the room and then remotely, to talk about the wonders of pulses. So probably we should start with a really basic issue, which is, what is a pulse? Right? We're not talking about this. We're talking about a food. So here in the group assembled here, who can tell me what a pulse is? This is why you came, right? This isn't a word we use very much in the US. This is more of a European term, but it means the edible seed of a legume. Now that begs the question, what is a legume? So these are plants in the bean and pea family, and they share a really important botanical characteristic that actually makes a big difference for sustainability and for health. But the reason we're talking about it today, and the reason we're using this somewhat unfamiliar term pulse, is because, as Krista said, the UN has declared 2016 the International Year of Pulses. Why does the United Nations care about pulses, and why do they want people to be aware of them? Two main reasons. One of them has to do with environmental sustainability, and one of them has to do with human health. So first on environmental sustainability, and here I'm going to show you for a minute this slide. All right, so here we have this graph from the Environmental Working Group showing the carbon footprint of various common foods in the American diet. So why do we see these pulse crops near the bottom of this graph? So you see very low carbon footprint associated with things like lentils, tofu, dry beans. All of these are pulse crops. All of these are legumes. Well, let's start with something that's a little bit more common in terms of the way we think about environmental health and what we eat. So anybody here trying to eat locally for environmental reasons? Yeah. So lots of different reasons you might eat locally. You might want to support local farmers. You might want to support wonderful local businesses. You might want to get to know your farmer. It might be about relational eating. But we also have this notion of the carbon footprint of our food having something to do with food miles, how far it's traveled. So a group of researchers looked into this. And they found that actually only about 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the average American diet come from transport to final point of sale. That's the metric that we know as food miles. Only about 4%. In contrast, 83% of emissions happen before food leaves the farm gate. Much of these emissions are associated with livestock production and then also nitrogen fertilizer. So why nitrogen fertilizer? Well, it takes a lot of fossil fuel to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And so the question is there an alternative to livestock production and using all this fertilizer? And the answer is yes. And that's what we've been doing for most of agricultural history. We've only had this synthetic fertilizer since the early 20th century. Farmers have only been using it since about the mid-20th century. And what people did before that is they had these plants, these leguminous plants, that could pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere where it's extremely abundant, and then work with bacteria in the soil to convert that nitrogen into a plant-available form, into fertilizer, and not only use it for their own fertility, we'll come back here for a moment to the graph, yes, but also for the fertility of the following crop. So they would leave this nitrogen fertilizer in the ground so that the following crop would have access to it. So this was an alternative to chemical fertilizer, and it's been accessible to farmers for all of agricultural history. So this is a way to get out of the carbon footprint of the livestock system, the carbon footprint of nitrogen fertilizer. So it means that legume crops and legume-based pastures, so pulses and their pasture crop friends, use 35 to 60% less fossil energy than chemically fertilized grains. So to go back to the graph, that is why the carbon footprint of these pulses, of these legumes, is so low, and why they're so important for sustainable agriculture. And that's just one of the many environmental reasons. They're putting fertility back in the ground, they're helping build soil health. They're absolutely critical to a food system that's sustainable in environmental terms. They're also critical to human health and to a food system in which all people have access to sufficient, healthy, culturally appropriate food. So I'm going to move to the next slide here. I work with lentil farmers. Why am I so excited about lentils? Well, I come from Montana. Grain agriculture has been the norm there for some time. And for all the reasons we just talked about environmentally, lentils are the key to making that grain agriculture system sustainable. And that's just one legume in one place. So this is true of other legumes in other places. But the genius of this relationship between grains and legumes is not just about the nutrition of the soil or about environmental health, but also very much about human health. So you're going to hear some great examples later from Larry, but I want to talk just a little bit about lentils and some things that I've learned since I started working on them. So you probably know that these crops are really high in protein. You might know about fiber. So lentils offer more than a third of the recommended intake of fiber in a half-cup portion. But these pulse crops are also really high in micronutrients. So a half-cup serving of lentils provides 45% of recommended daily folate, which is necessary for the production of red blood cells and protein metabolism. You've probably heard it's important for women of childbearing age because of its role in the developing embryo. Also, a cup of lentils has potassium comparable to a banana. Potassium important for electrolyte and fluid balance, as well as muscle and cardiac function. And this one was probably the most surprising to me, antioxidants. So I would normally think of something like blueberries or acai, but it turns out that lentils actually have 56% more antioxidant capacity than blueberries. So these are these nutrition-packed foods that have been really important staples for working people for all of agricultural history, more or less. And then the other thing, so we talked about environmental health, we talked about human health and public health, but they're also totally delicious, right? These are these crops that have been used for all of agricultural history. So they have 10,000, some archaeologists say 18,000 years of culinary traditions associated with them from all over the world. So on that note, I want to transition to our next speaker, and I want to tell you a little bit about his story too. So we're going to hear now from Minh Tsai, who's the founder, director, CEO of Hodo Soy. And Minh, as a child in Vietnam, often took morning strolls with his grandpa to the neighborhood tofu shack. The freshness and artisanal quality of the soy milk, tofu, and yuba of his childhood eluded Minh for many years when he came here to the United States. But finally in 2004, he founded Hodo Soy with the simple mission of crafting the highest quality, best tasting, freshest soy milk, tofu, and yuba tofu skins possible. These days, Minh remains actively involved in the production and innovation of tofu, as well as being tofu's ultimate ambassador by working with chefs, teaching tofu craft, and educating culinary students to grow the next generation of tofu aficionados. Before becoming Hodo's tofu master, Minh spent 10 years in strategic consulting and finance, and he graduated from Columbia with a BA and master's in economic development. Minh.
Thanks, Liz. I haven't had that formal introduction for a long time. It sounded kind of funny. because these days I'm a tofu maker. My name is Minh Tsai. If you don't know me, it's okay because you're eating my tofu at Google. In fact, our tofu is in all your campuses in the West Coast as well as in the East Coast and other parts of the country as well. The reason I really enjoy these types of forum with Liz and Larry, who's going to come on later and talk about health. So I get to talk about the food part. Because usually when I give a talk by myself, you know, I'm somewhat of a hack when it comes to all the data that Liz talks about and the hack and all the health part that Larry talks about. So now I have all the supports. Before I start, I'm going to play you a video. It's called Tofu Disrupt. It's an event that we've done recently. And I'll play the video and then I'll come back to it to talk about how we get people to eat more pulses, more beans. But essentially, the video is it's a series of events called Tofu Disrupt. And the idea behind it is to really educate people about beans. And in this case, tofu in particular. Tofu has a really short history in America, less than 50 years, relative to its history in Asia, which is several thousand years. So in our education, we basically want people not just to understand the history of where tofu comes from, but also how we in the US use tofu and how the use of tofu really changed our perception and taste of tofu. So I assume many of you eat tofu. That's why you're at this event and you eat beans. But tofu wasn't really consumed very much here by the American public until the late 70s. And the reason for that is because tofu was introduced here by the Japanese and the Chinese more than 100 years ago, but it remains in the enclave, you know, in the Chinatown and the Japantown. The reason for that is because there was very little interaction, like the public doesn't really go into Chinatown grocery store to shop. That's one reason. But the second reason is tofu is one of these foods that's not really packaged. You know, we're so used to wrap the bean curd like prized cheese. So for me, I wanted tofu to be a canvas for really innovative chefs, and that's why we have these events. My name is Minh Tsai, and I'm a tofu maker. Growing up in Vietnam, my grandfather would take me to the local tofu shack where we bought freshly made, delicious tofu every day. The memory of that tofu was my inspiration for starting Hodo Soy 10 years ago. At Hodo, we treat tofu making as both an art and a science. Our focus is on making the highest quality tofu possible. So we start with the best organic, US-grown soybeans we can find. We select beans with a specific protein and fat content to produce what we believe is the ideal mouthfeel and flavor. We soak the soybeans overnight and then grind and cook them to extract the rich soy milk. To this, we add a traditional mineral coagulant. Then, we hand wrap the bean curd like prized cheese and press it into a variety of textures, soft and firm. The result is tofu that's creamy, nutty, and rich. But making delicious tofu and yuba is only one part of what we do. At Hodo, we're also educators and ambassadors of all things tofu. We want to disrupt the pervasive idea that tofu is just an ingredient in Asian food or a bland meat substitute. So, I started a series of events called Tofu Disrupt. Well, welcome to Hodo. We're going to do a quick tour. Come on in. My mission is to take chefs on a deeper dive into the art and science of tofu. Anybody want to make tofu? To show them the transformation from beans to liquid, from liquid to solid, and how this process influences tofu's various textures and flavors. And then press it down. This is where the muscle comes in, guys. There you go. I want to reveal the true versatility of tofu as a canvas on which to create a supporting player or a delicious star ingredient. All right. Tofu Disrupt is meant to inspire the chefs to create entirely new dishes that highlight tofu's wide range of flavors and textural profiles.
So I chose to do this dish and use the okara, which is normally, as Minh told us today, given to farms for animals. So we started trying to make porridge with it, and then we started smoking it and adding onions and garlic, and I feel came up with a pretty tasty product with something that is normally discarded.
I'm Moroccan in heritage, so I kind of went a North African route, and I fell in love with the namuyuba. Was just like mind-blowing. The other day I tasted it and I was like, wow, this is an amazing product.
I did a parsnip cooked in soy milk. I'm serving with a parsnip cake.
I wanted to use the firm tofu and incorporate it in a very traditional Filipino dish, which is pork adobo.
I wanted to think of a dish that would mimic the textures of burrata. So some fresh soy milk, coagulating it, that's all going to be encased in a sheet of yuba.
My goal is to redefine tofu as a complex, cuisine-transcending ingredient. To do that, I want to reacquaint chefs with tofu that is deeply traditional, expertly crafted, and a foundation for culinary innovation. At Hodo, we believe the possibilities for tofu are endless. What do you guys think? That looked pretty good, right? We just did one in New York. I just came back, and it was a bigger event than the one we did in San Francisco. But the reason we did these Tofu Disrupt events, it's really to not just to educate the public, but also to educate chefs. I was talking earlier about how tofu was introduced here less than 50 years ago, even though it was already in the Chinese and the Japanese enclaves, 50 years before that. When tofu was introduced to the U.S., it was very much introduced as a vegetarian food, a food that would save our planet from overconsumption. And I believe in that. I believe tofu can be a great vegetarian food that will save our planet, not just from an ecological standpoint, but also from the health standpoint. But for me, the fact that it was introduced so narrowly as a vegetarian food, and more importantly, as a meat substitute, was really a wrong introduction. Because the people who introduced tofu to America as a meat substitute really didn't understand the chemistry and the culinary aspect of tofu. So for about 40, 50 years, we Americans end up eating tofu that's firm or extra firm. And it's not very tasty that way. And then we also never invested the time to educate the chefs how to use the tofu. So instead of growing, tofu basically remained more or less as this mystery food that's not very tasty. I mean, I'm sure some of you might have had it from your parents, from your grandparents, and you probably thought, I'm probably never going to eat this again. So our goal at Hodo for the last 10 years is, yes, we want to tell you that tofu is really healthy and very different from soy protein isolate and all the mock meat out there. But we also want to tell you that put in the right hand, our hands, or a chef's hand, and in some cases, in your hands now, tofu can be delicious. People will eat it if it's delicious. So our mission is to craft a high quality ingredient for chefs to make it more delicious. But we also have a line of products that you can find in the grocery stores that are selling like hotcakes. We just recently launched a mapo tofu, and mapo tofu is the third most popular Chinese dish in any restaurant. And we just launched one just last week, and it's really outselling everything else. Why? It's because it tastes good. It's because the ingredient is good.
Well, thank you. I think Minh has convinced you that you want to eat pulses. You definitely want to eat tofu. And I think Larry will convince you that you not only want to do this because it's delicious, but you're doing yourself a favor as well. So Lawrence H. Kushi is Director of Scientific Policy at the Kaiser Permanente Northern California Division of Research. Prior to joining the Division of Research, Dr. Kushi was at Columbia University, where he held the Ella McCollum Valtake Chair in Human Nutrition in the Department of Health and Behavior Studies, Teachers College, and he was a member of the Herbert Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. Dr. Kushi is internationally recognized for his expertise in nutritional epidemiology, and his research interests focus on the role of diet and nutrition in the etiology of coronary artery disease and breast and other cancers. He serves on a grant review committee for the American Cancer Society and has served on various American Cancer Society committees to develop guidelines for the dietary prevention and management of cancer. Dr. Kushi has also served on review committees for the Epidemiology and Disease Control Study section of the National Institutes of Health and the integration panel of the Breast Cancer Research Program of the U.S. Army Medical Research and Materiel Command. He was formerly the chair of the Food and Nutrition section of the American Public Health Association and on the executive committee of the American Society of Preventive Oncology. So trust this guy when it comes to your long-term health. Larry Kushi.
Okay, thank you, Liz. That was more than I expected. So in any case, thank you, Krista, the Farm to Table, is that what the program is called, for the invitation. I've got some slides. Being an academic sort of leaning person, I sort of lean on these slides presentation, but don't take that as being any more formal than anything else. So why don't we show these, and then we'll switch back to showing the panel. Okay. So what's up with protein foods? Okay. I'm going to zip through these and not necessarily spend a lot of time on any particular thing. Start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. Whatever I say here is not, doesn't represent the views of Kaiser Permanente in any official capacity. It's just me, okay? So every 5 years, the U.S. government, the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services put out these dietary guidelines. So this year was the year that the dietary guidelines were reissued. 2010, then 2015, which usually means around the end of that year. So this was actually issued pretty much in January, early January. And one of the things I'll just point out is that they talk about a healthy eating pattern, okay? So here are the major elements or food groups that the dietary guidelines say are part of a healthy eating pattern. Okay, so one of these things does not look like the other, okay, as they say in Sesame Street, okay? So which of these things doesn't quite look like the others, okay? Protein, yeah, exactly, okay? So this would be kind of like, for those of you, since we're at Google, I'll use this analogy, but this would be kind of like your smartphone screen and the different apps, and it says YouTube and, sort of Google Maps and whatever these things, and then this thing says JavaScript or something like that, okay? So protein is not a food, okay? It's not something that we go to this grocery store and purchase, And so why is it there? It's basically a history of the U.S. government and basically combining animal foods and legumes into one group, okay? And so these little sort of crescents here come from the previous graphic that was used related to the dietary guidelines, which is here, and basically does the same thing. There's that protein group. Okay, so combining these different foods into the same food group, does this make any sense? Okay, here's your beautiful Angus cow, okay? Part of the protein food group, so to speak, okay? Here are a bunch of legumes, okay? Part of the protein food group. Okay, so do these really look like they belong in the same food group? Only a nutritional biochemist would really think that these two are the same thing, okay? Or are similar enough that they really should be combined. So one of the things that is a key component of why those don't belong together is that the meat side of things, particularly the red meat and processed meat, is actually something you shouldn't be eating a lot of. Whereas the legumes are actually something you should be including in your diet, okay? Something that you should be eating. So here's a report that was published last year from the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which basically links meat to cancer risk. It's now class 1 carcinogen as recognized by IARC, in the same category as tobacco, smoke, asbestos, etc., in terms of being a clear causal agent for cancer risk. Now, one of the things that I've been involved in is volunteering for the American Cancer Society and chairing, in this case, the last time that they updated their guidelines for cancer prevention and nutrition and physical activity for cancer prevention. This is the actual reference if you're interested in that, published in 2002. But here's basically what we said on this committee. We said that there are basically these 4 main sort of things that one could potentially do for cancer prevention: achieve and maintain a healthy weight, be physically active, consume a healthy diet with an emphasis on plant sources, and limit alcohol beverage consumption. So if we look at the healthy diet portion, then basically we say, things like limit consumption of processed and red meat, eat at least 2.5 cups of vegetables and fruit each day, choose whole grains instead of refined grains. Each one of these statements has a lot of scientific literature behind them. We don't explicitly talk about legumes there, but we probably should next time around. This is a comparable report from the World Cancer Research Fund, which is based in London, in the UK, and the American Institute for Cancer Research, which is based in Washington, D.C. This was published in 2007, and they're going to be updating this and releasing it in a couple of years in terms of their updated guidelines. So their recommendations are basically very similar. They're looking at the same scientific literature published around the world. And so if you look at the last point on this particular slide, eat more of a variety of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and legumes such as beans. So clearly they call out legumes, which we probably should have, but we didn't. And they also say limit consumption of red meats. So very different messages for these things that, at least in the dietary guidelines, US dietary guidelines graphic, are lumped together in the way that they're talked about. So let's take a look at this, okay? Limit consumption of processed and red meats. That's what we said as the American Cancer Society. And the World Cancer Research Fund, at least in an updated report specifically related to colorectal cancer, they say the evidence is convincing that these things increase the risk of colon cancer. Okay, so let's take a look at this just as one example of how we and the World Cancer Research Fund come up with these sorts of recommendations. Okay, so in colon cancer rates vary tremendously around the world. It's like 40-fold difference. And these are just select areas around the world. The top line are African-American men and women in the United States who have among the highest rates of colon cancer around the world. The third one down is people of European descent, ancestry in the US, also very high. Down below are like India, Madras here, Chiang Mai in Thailand, etc. Wide variation in colon cancer rates. Okay. Now, published in 1990 was the first prospective cohort study, which means a bunch of people were enrolled, in this case nurses. They were given food questionnaires in 1980, and then they were followed for 6 years and determined who developed colon cancer and who didn't. Okay. And so the nurses who reported eating red meat as a main dish every single day, okay, compared with those who reported very rarely eating red meat, they had a 2.5-fold greater likelihood of developing colon cancer over that 6-year period. And you can see the more frequently the meat was consumed, the greater the likelihood of developing colon cancer. Okay. So this is the first such study design to look at this. There were a couple other studies of different study design that provided clues that this might be going on. There have now been a couple dozen of these studies, so this is a meta-analysis of these prospective studies, and I'll just say that here's the conclusion. High intake of red and processed meat is associated with significant increased risk of colorectal, colon, and rectal cancers. The overall evidence from prospective studies support limiting red and processed meat consumption as one of the dietary recommendations for the prevention of colorectal cancer. So highly consistent findings across all these different studies that are conducted, not just in the United States, which that first one was, but in Argentina, Australia, various parts of the United States, and China and Japan and other places. So let's look back at sort of colon cancer trends over time. Here's India, okay, Mumbai. There's a cancer registry there. very low rates, continues to be low, okay, as time goes on. Here's the United States, Connecticut, as an example, one of the cancer registry. Again, among the highest rates in the world, generally speaking. These are rates in men. Okay, let's take a look at Japan. Very low rates, just back in 1960, now among the highest rates in the world. Okay, this is Shanghai in China. Similar trends going on as we saw in Japan, but delayed a bit. There are things, very powerful things happening in the world that results in these changes in disease rates. This is in women. You see the same pattern. The rates are a little bit lower, but basically the same pattern. Okay. So in India, of course, cows are considered to be sacred, at least in some contexts. And so you often see them wandering around the city streets and that type of thing. The first McDonald's that was vegetarian was in India, you know. So what's been going on in these other Asian countries that resulted in this type of change? Okay? Maybe something like this, not to specifically point to those golden arches. One colleague says, you know, when you see the golden arches, you know, you're looking at the pearly gates. You're not far from the pearly gates. So, any case, if we look at actual food consumption from the Food and Agricultural Organization, then you can see, again, Japan, increasing consumption of these animal products. In the US, very high levels. In India, very low levels. Directly parallels these colon cancer rate trends. Yeah, it's all of them combined together because that was the easiest thing for me to pull out for the purpose of this particular slide. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, should red meat be separated out? Ultimately, yes, because the health effects do differ among different animal food products, and red meat is probably, and processed meat in particular, is probably the worst thing. But yeah, and fish, we probably should be eating some on some sort of regular basis if one is going to eat animal products. And milk, there's a lot of controversy about, and same with eggs. And we can go into some of that if you want, even though that's aside from this whole question about pulses. Okay, so looking at the pulse side of things, this other part of this protein foods sort of group, this is an analysis that we did way back when I was on the faculty at the University of Minnesota. And if we look at the sort of the turquoise bars, people who reported any tofu or soy intake had about a 25% reduction in developing breast cancer over about a 6 or 7 year period than people who didn't report any. Okay, so this is from a study of women in Iowa, about 40,000 women, actually about 35,000 in this analysis. But what's the problem with doing such a study in the US? Okay, so thanks to people like Minh, Tsai, tofu, etc., is more widely available now. But in Iowa, less than 3% of these 35,000 women reported eating any tofu or soy foods, right? And so, if you actually want to look at this, you don't have much power, as you say, statistical power, to look at it. So, which is ironic. Iowa produces tons of soy, but most of it goes to feed the pigs. So Iowa's also a big pork-producing state. So in order to actually look at this question, it's better to go to a population where people eat a fair amount and there's variation. So here's a study in Shanghai that I was involved in. And you can see that basically women who reported more soy consumption compared with less soy consumption had somewhat lower breast cancer risk, not statistically significant, but still there. This is their soy intake as reported when they were adolescents. A clear relationship, high soy intake, lower likelihood of developing breast cancer a few decades later. And there are other studies that have looked at this. Here's a meta-analysis, again, of several studies. Basically, these dark squares are the high versus low relative risk. If the dark square is on this side of this vertical line, then that means the high intake results in less breast cancer than the low intake. If it's on this side, then it means high intake is higher risk than higher rates of breast cancer than the low intake. But overall, when you combine the results across all of these, and most of the studies show higher soy intake, less breast cancer, then you get this relative risk, which is here, 0.71, about a 30% reduction in breast cancer, comparing high soy intake to low soy intake across these various studies. This is the same thing, studies in Western populations where there's not much soy intake being consumed, except in hidden things like, sort of soy lecithin and as flavoring and whatever. And so there's not much variation. You don't see too much. Anyway, so I'll skip over this. These are the same sort of another way of looking at meta-analysis, but conducted by other people. But soy intake and other diseases, this is from studies in Shanghai again, the Shanghai Women's Health Study, which has been following 75,000 women in Shanghai for a number of years. Decreased likelihood of cardiovascular disease events, less diabetes, half the diabetes rate of people with high soy intake versus low soy intake, less bone fractures, so a lot of sort of effects of this. Now, is it the soy per se or dietary pattern that includes soy? It's a little hard to disentangle that, but clearly dietary patterns that include regular consumption of soy foods are better for you than dietary patterns that don't. Okay? So as was mentioned earlier, year of the pulses, that's this year. The United Nations has just described that. And so this has also already been mentioned, but each one of these statements, like our dietary recommendations, a lot of literature that supports each of these. But pulses are highly nutritious, as Liz mentioned, economically accessible, contribute to food security, important health benefits. I just demonstrated or pointed to some of them, specifically in the soy context, but this can be extrapolated to other arenas as well. Lots of evidence that legume intake in general, is great for cardiovascular disease risk, et cetera, for lowering risk. Foster sustainable ag and contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, and promote biodiversity. So these are all important. So when you look at that food group, it's kind of like, okay, it's not really an appropriate food group, but to the extent that some parts of it, okay, don't do that. Okay, cows going to the slaughterhouse. They say, my only consolation is that by eating us, they're killing themselves. Okay. Then that's pork, the meat of the pig. It makes an excellent substitute for tofu. Okay. This is where we should be. Instead of sort of thinking about, legumes as a substitute for red meat, it should be the other way around. When we go on an airplane, the default sort of meal that's, of course, you don't get meals anymore domestically, but internationally, it should be something that's vegetarian. And then if you want to have the meat, that should be a special meal option or something like that, rather than the way it is now. So anyway, we can go into more detail about other things. I will say, I mentioned this at the last panel that I participated in with Liz, but I'll just say that just recently, I was at a couple of conferences, cancer-related conferences. I do cancer research. I heard Vice President Biden talking about the cancer moonshot, et cetera, and what we can do to accelerate, sort of advances in cancer research, decrease the cancer burden, et cetera. A lot of interest in all this, sort of stuff that's happening at cancer centers and stuff. The work that my other two colleagues here, the work that they're doing is going to have a much bigger impact on impacting cancer rates than those targeted therapies and other things that lots of money are going into, because they're having a direct impact on these risk factors, these dietary changes that will actually result in impacting cancer rates. And so it's like I bow down to these people, compared with what I do, sitting in a, conference room or, at my desk in a computer and whatever and analyzing data. So anyway, thanks, and have them join us.
Thank you. And ask us questions. I always have lots of questions of these two, but yeah. Let's make sure repeat the question. So the question is basically, would this look different, this red meat, all of these red meat statistics, if we weren't in a concentrated animal feeding lot, but actually working with pastured meat, with grass-fed meat? What's the difference?
Yeah, so the direct answer to that question is we don't really know, because most of the types of studies that I do, these epidemiologic studies, don't ask about that type of detail. But I will say that the fact that these findings have been seen consistently around the world in countries which have different sort of animal husbandry regulations, maybe not necessarily how much, cows come from feedlots versus, out in the pasture, range fed or whatever. But the fact that some of the other practices, people often talk about things like the use of antibiotics and to help, low-level antibiotics to help feed the cows, or hormone implants or whatever. We see similar findings in Europe or in Japan, for example, as in the U.S., where here in the U.S. most beef cattle are given estrogen sort of implants or estrogen analog implants like Zeranol or something, whereas those same implants are banned in those countries because of potential human health effects. And so, but we see the same sort of effect, which suggests that it may not be driven by those specifically. I mean, they may have some role on some level, but it doesn't describe everything that's going on. So it doesn't directly answer your question, but it does point to the fact that their consistent finding in different countries suggests that it's probably cows.
One thing that I think is really interesting to bring up about pastured meat and grass-fed production is that if our whole country switched exclusively to grass-fed production, we would all eat a lot less meat. So that may be the most powerful health effect.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the issues that I see as a food manufacturer in the U.S. Is that we have several fascinating tendency in the United States. One is whatever we think it's good, we tend to just eat a ton of it. So this term moderation, it's almost lost in our consciousness. One of the reasons we did Tofu Disrupt from a culinary side is to say to the public here that you don't necessarily have to think of, tofu as strictly a vegetarian food, because believe it or not, in Asia, it is often eaten with meat, but it's very proportionate. The meat is just a very small portion. So perhaps portion control is the answer here, and not necessarily even tofu or vegetarian or legumes for that matter. So I think I would be curious to learn more about, the cases of Japan, for example, the quantity consumed, and the frequency of consuming red meat. I think they will have actually a greater impact, because I don't think necessarily that the Japanese are eating less tofu necessarily, maybe, but I think proportionately everything else are eating in greater quantity. So that's my concern.
Yeah, that's actually right. The sort of soy food, generally sort of consumption in Japan hasn't decreased, but the meat intake has gone up. Sort of rice intake has dropped and some other things like that. Yes.
First of all, Minh, you came here in October and you did a really lovely dish with Chef Liv where you mixed the ground tofu and ground pork, and you had that same spiel about how you don't have to replace meat, but you can flavor it with this tofu and you're already decreasing meat consumption. So thank you for that back in October. But for Dr. Larry, correct?
You call me Larry.
Okay, yeah. Larry. I've done a lot of research on dietary guidelines globally, and it's fascinating how consistent the world is inconsistent, like with these food groups, and how like protein, for example, here, how we group it is very different in different parts of the world, but nutritional comes from the same science. So obviously the government plays a part, or food preference like in India. And I'm sure you've seen Switzerland with their new guidelines, and they've taken out the red meat recommendation, and I'm sure have lower cases of cancer. And I wonder if the United States is slowly moving towards that. Could you see them pulling out pulses as their own food groups, or kind of recommending red meat less and less as these guidelines are updated?
Yeah, so there are at least in the US dietary guidelines context, there are two phases. There's sort of the scientific updated review that happens, and then a different group of people take those and translate those into the actual guidelines. And so that second process, well, the first process is semi-political in terms of who gets onto that committee. Different, interest groups nominate various people, et cetera. But the work that they do is largely sort of apolitical, sort of review of the scientific literature, et cetera. And so the report that they put out, in this case, it came out a little over a year ago, to inform what become the dietary guidelines, is largely apolitical. The next step is not, And so what ultimately becomes the dietary guidelines, there are a lot of competing considerations. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as great an organization it is for a lot of the things that they do, they have competing and contradictory sort of priorities. And one is to promote human health, through good food selection and food security programs like the school lunch program and food stamps and other things like that. And the other is to help support the agricultural industry. And so sometimes, way back when we didn't know that red meat actually was bad, those didn't necessarily conflict, and sort of food security issues were more paramount than chronic disease risk. But now they do conflict in terms of the overall mission. And so it's pretty hard for the USDA to say, eat less red meat. And in fact, the last time they actually said that in any sort of official publication was in 1979. Okay? They've changed it to these euphemisms like choose lean meats, or other things like that. So their official publications in terms of guidelines, et cetera, don't really say that. But I will say that generally speaking, the trend that you were talking about has been happening, because in the last dietary guidelines and in the current dietary guidelines, 2010 and 2015, they now explicitly recognize that vegetarian eating patterns, Mediterranean eating patterns are actually healthful choices, that these are not things that, back when I started, studying nutrition or whatever, vegetarian sort of concept of that was like considered to be sort of on the, sort of on the way extreme, sort of wacky sort of thing. And now, even though there still aren't large numbers of vegetarians proportion-wise, it's now considered to be healthful. So it's not. So I think elements are definitely moving in that direction. Yeah.
I'll just add something really quickly. I don't have the type of data, scientific data that Larry gathers. But what I've noticed, based on having been around and making tofu for more than 10 years, is that with the advent of social media, of information that you guys help foster at Google, people are just more knowledgeable about the food that they consume. So now it's a matter of getting that data out there, like the way Liz and Larry are doing. So Liz on the ecological side, Larry on the health side. So my job is just to make it taste good. That's the trifecta right there, right? So if people can understand that, okay, this is the ecological impact with your decision when it comes to food, Larry can give you, this is the health impact, and I can tell you, like, this is great, our tofu is amazing, but don't eat it every day. Eat it proportionately with other food and have a balanced diet. So I think that's something that, to Larry's point when he finished, that's prevention right there of any form of disease. So that's what we try to do as a food company, as a responsible food company too. So I see the trend in the US actually being very optimistic because of information.
Thanks for coming to talk about the tofu. I really enjoy drinking the soy milk. I've been drinking it over a year now. It's a really great substitute for milk. And one question I have for you is, there's a couple ways to make soy milk. One is, I saw on your video, you could boil it and then, soak it with water and then boil it and then take the skin off. One way to do it. I think this is similar to what you can get in the supermarket with the unsweetened soy milk. Another way to do it I saw is using a blender, high speed, and then just blend it, and you drink, including the skin of the milk or of the beans. One thing I read on the internet is about if you eat a lot of the skin of the bean, it could affect your health. I'd like to hear your thought on that.
I'll leave the health part to Larry, but as far as making soy milk, you need to make soy milk to make tofu. So as a tofu company, we make the soy milk first, and the way we make it is quite traditional. And when I mean traditional, what I mean is we make it in a way where we don't waste. We make it in a way where we give respect to the beans, which means we actually grind the beans and we cook it with the ground up slurry of the bean itself for the flavor. We don't run away from the flavors of the beans. Many soy milk you get in the supermarket don't have the beanie flavors. I like people to try to really drink soy milk with that legume flavors, because I think you can get used to it. In Asia, soy milk is prized for that actual fragrance of the beans. So I think we'll get there in time. And then for me, we also try to make a soy milk with high fiber. I would prefer to actually leave all that fiber in there, because I think it's actually good for digestion to have the fiber. So if you can use a blender and make it at home, and you can actually blend it fine enough to have the fiber go through your system, I think it's healthier. Now, make sure you use organic, non-GMO soybeans, so that that would be what my suggestion is. But Larry can chime in as far as the health impact of, eating the entire legume.
It does taste better with the skin in it. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, I just say, that's probably the better way to consume it, but, sort of including some tofu or whatever, and other soy foods that are derived from other parts of the soybean, I think that's great. That, as we saw in the video, the yuba or whatever, there are other parts in the whole sort of soy processing process. You could do this all at home. Actually, we used to, when I was growing up, we used to make tofu at home. And because it wasn't readily available except like in the Chinatown, so you would go to there or whatever. And so actually one of the first tofu companies in the US was started by some students of my parents, Nasoya, which started in Massachusetts way back when, and there are others that, sort of grew from that. But in any case, it's, definitely, if you can eat the whole soybean, even if it's in different foods, that's great. If you blend up the soybean, the whole soybean as you're making soy milk, that's great too.
So as far as you know, there's no long-term effect on health.
So
including
I'm guessing, total guess here, so don't hold me to this, but I'm guessing that the suggestion there might be related to things like protease inhibitors and phytic acid and some of these other things that in theory might bind some minerals and sort of inhibit absorption from if you have like more of the outer part of the soybean sort of as part of what you have. Those things, while there's some truth to all that, those things are also probably some of the reasons why eating these products, legumes in general and whole grains as well, are healthful for cardiovascular disease risk, heart disease risk. That's where a lot of the antioxidant properties come from. That's where, sort of the ability to potentially, sort of inhibit, in the soy context, inhibit sort of cell proliferation, or some other things that probably play a role in cancer. So overall, I mean, there may be these individual sort of possible sort of negative health effects, but overall it probably actually contributes to why these are healthful foods.
I'll tell something funny. We actually all over the world eat legumes very similarly. We actually rehydrate them often, and then we slow cook them for our body to actually absorb all the nutrients of the beans, whole beans. Tofu is totally an accidental discovery. Somebody was cooking beans in a pot with excess water and decided to flavor it with something that's acidic, which turns that protein liquid into a solid. So if you think about, eating organic carrot with the peel on is so much more nutritious than peeling it off, for example. So the fact that you're eating the entire bean is probably good.
I hear lots of concerns around high content of estrogens, and I'm not sure, is this in general a concern? Is it conventional soy versus organic soy, or what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So Min maybe has some other ideas, or maybe Liz too. But okay. So one of the things that soybeans in particular, compared with other legumes, is pretty much sort of known for, in a sense, is relatively high what are called phytoestrogen content, and isoflavones, which soy beans are really great source for, concentrated source of, are phytoestrogens, meaning that they have potential estrogenic activity. Okay, so genistein is one of these isoflavones. Daidzein is another one, and there are a couple others that exist in soy foods and also in some other legumes as well as some other foods. Okay, so the question really is, okay, does consuming these have a negative health impact? Okay, now it's clear that if you take genistein or daidzein or whatever, and you put it in tissue culture, and you've got these cells, these MCF7 cells or whatever, which are sort of breast cancer, estrogen-sensitive breast cancer cells, then the cells will proliferate. Okay, they've got estrogen receptors on them. The isoflavones bind to those. It causes cell proliferation. If you do the same kind of thing, you take a xenograft and you stick it onto an animal or something like that, and then you give them a lot of these, isoflavones, that tumor is going to start growing or whatever. Okay, but what actually happens in real life in human beings? Okay, as the studies that I showed you, breast cancer risk, which is in fact related to endogenous estrogen levels. If anything, people who are eating soy on a regular basis have lower likelihood of developing breast cancer. And now there's 3 or 4 studies that show that women with breast cancer, including hormone receptor positive breast cancer, who have more soy intake compared with less, not going overboard, but more compared with less, they actually have better prognosis, lower recurrence rates and better survival rates. So this theoretical sort of concern that you can demonstrate in tissue culture doesn't translate into what actually happens in human populations. And so, if anything, eating soy, including women with hormone receptor positive breast cancer, it's certainly not something to avoid that you need to be concerned about, despite what a lot of people say out there. So anyway, that's one sort of general thing that I'd say.
My lay interpretation of this data, and I've been really interested following this discussion, is that it reinforces this recommendation that we should eat whole foods, that there is some genius in the combination of compounds in actual plants that is destroyed when you isolate compounds from those plants and eat them by themselves, that there's something very different that happens when a human metabolizes that.
Yeah, I would agree. Actually, there's an upcoming conference at the National Cancer Institute next week about dietary patterns and where research should be moving in terms of, really thinking about the whole combination of things. There's this whole concept in some of the nutrition research area of food synergy, which is combinations of nutrients and different foods and how that may be more important for health than sort of looking at isolated individual compounds like genistein or whatever. So I think there's growing recognition that, when we think about these things, we should, sort of step back and not focus on individual nutrients per se, or dietary components.
And I think on a culinary note, I think whole food just tastes better. The least processed it is, actually, if you teach people how to cook with it, it actually tastes so much better than processed food. We eat processed food because we want to keep it for a long shelf life. We eat processed food because it's cheaper in many cases. But many of the processed food, like one of the cheapest form of processed food is soy protein isolate. It's in everything, but it was never meant to be a food. It was supposed to be a paper coating, a paint coating, but it was never meant to be a food. But some genius thought, hey, this is super cheap, and I can add some flavor to it and turn it into like mock hot dog. So now you have something that's like $1.99. That is soy food, but it's not necessarily as healthy as eating whole beans. So try to eat as little processed as possible. Same with meat. That's why processed meat is up there. So, all right, that's all I'm going to say about health, because Larry's here. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Liz.
Thank you so much, all of you who are here watching us remotely. Liz Carlisle, Dr. Lawrence Kushi, Minh Tsai. Feel free to ask us questions afterward. You saw our emails on the slides.